Waking Up to Serenity, Unlocking the Door to Emotional Sobriety by Angelo. Chapter 14. Mind the Gaps. Addiction can be a baffling condition to overcome, and emotional sobriety can remain elusive. The root of the problem is the personal ego self, yet this personal identity is so habitual and ingrained that it takes time and practice before it begins to loosen its grip. This process takes quite some time for most of us. It will certainly take several months, and in many cases it will take several years. For others, it may take even longer. Some addicts remain abstinent and struggle with recovery for decades without ever fully grasping what recovery is really all about. Such is the power of being attached to the personal ego self. This attachment to our personal thoughts and feelings creates many traps and obstacles to recovery. These keep us confined as a wave on the surface and prevent us from diving below and learning to breathe underwater. Until the necessary awakening occurs, the overall problem is that the personal ego self makes most of the decisions, and yet it is the personal ego self that is the core problem. We are using a selfish, self-centered mind to decide how and when we will go about trying to be less selfish and self-centered. This catch-22 type problem can easily keep us trapped in personal suffering for a long time and can often lead us back to a relapse with devastating consequences. I've witnessed many recoveries, and I've also seen many relapses. These relapses never have a good outcome for the addict or their loved ones. Sometimes a relapse results in death. This is the nature of addiction. Recovery is a serious business, and it's wise to be aware of the many pitfalls. It would be unrealistic to attempt to provide a definitive list of all these traps and obstacles. Unique human beings have unique problems, and nevertheless there are similarities and common mistakes. Our deeper understanding of the solution to addiction and emotional sobriety should enable us to identify these common mistakes and comprehend why they occur. If we can be forewarned, then at least we can be forearmed. I can only share my experience. I've made most of the mistakes listed below and have observed the remainder in others with whom I have worked closely. Effective and sustained recovery requires persistent, consistent effort until it becomes effortless. The purpose is to facilitate a transformation in identity from personal ego self to universal consciousness. All of the pitfalls fit into the category of traps and obstacles that prevent this persistent and consistent effort. All of them are the product of thoughts, opinions, and beliefs of the personal ego mind. The personal ego self is not only the entire problem, but we also create the barriers that prevent the simple solution from being effective. Little wonder that success rates are quite low. We are literally sabotaging ourselves. The title of this chapter sums up the potential problem. Any gap in our commitment to recovery will create difficulties. These difficulties will range from dis-ease to despair to relapse to death. If we want effective recovery, then we need to mind the gaps as if our lives depend upon it. The first barriers arise before recovery even starts. 12-step recovery is either unheard of or perceived to be unnecessary or not attractive. Other treatment options may seem more desirable, and 12-step recovery may be seen as a last resort. We may believe that our addiction and mental health condition is different from others, and that 12-step recovery is not sufficient. We may feel that a solution that's free of charge cannot possibly be as good as those that we have to pay for. There may be shame or embarrassment at the idea of having to attend 12-step meetings. We may have a friend or family member who has tried 12-step recovery and not found it to their liking. The list of reasons for not even starting goes on, and all of them are based on misunderstanding. If we do finally attend a 12-step meeting, then we are immediately confronted with the God word. Most personal selves have preconceived ideas about what this word means. Some of these ideas are helpful, but many of them are not. The fact that all fellowships clearly state that it is God as we understood him is often not sufficient to overcome prejudice. There is suspicion that this is just a ruse to get us started, and that eventually we will have to concede to the Christian idea of God or some other collective concept. If we're not prepared to be open-minded from the outset, then the God word can be a big barrier to recovery. The personal ego self thus creates a self-imposed restriction on its own potential salvation. Another early pitfall is a lack of belief that a simple 12-step program can be an effective solution to the complex and soul-destroying handicap of addiction. Other fellowship members tell us sincerely that it does work, but the personal mind struggles to see how it possibly can. There is skepticism and a lack of trust. We place too much faith in our own minds and reject the well-meaning help and advice of others. Our own arrogant thinking continues to thwart us, despite the positive evidence of success in others that is readily available. The next problem is that the personal ego self considers itself to be special and different. There is a tendency to compare ourselves to others. If we feel that others are far worse than us, then the personal mind will conclude that 12-step recovery is not necessary, or that we don't need to put in as much effort as they do. If, however, we think that we are worse than others, then we may feel that 12-step recovery is not a strong enough solution for our particular case. The personal ego self will find ways to maintain its uniqueness and hence rule itself out of the solution. It will resist true fellowship in favour of illusory independence. Addicts have formed the habit of self-harm. The abuse of substances and addictive behaviour arises from low self-esteem and a lack of self-worth. We're not used to taking care of ourselves. Even if we do seek recovery, these tendencies towards self-harm can prevent us from engaging in the very practices that will lead to the solution. We are now so familiar with not feeling good that the idea of a more positive outlook on life seems uncomfortable. We can actually feel safe in a state of depression, resentment and self-pity. We seem to suffer from a subconscious desire to sabotage our own well-being. Well, all of this is a distorted function of the personal ego mind, and it prevents the qualities of universal consciousness from being expressed. We have to let this go. Each of us is worthy of recovery, whatever may have happened in the past. Human beings prefer not to look at their own shortcomings, but instead deny their own brokenness. We would rather judge, criticize and blame others than admit our own faults. Even if we admit that we are addicts, there will still be a reluctance to turn the spotlight inwards and look at our darker side. We may fear exposing deep-seated issues and prefer to let sleeping dogs lie. We maintain the mask of persona at the expense of self-honesty. The personal ego self protects its own self-image. We may see addiction as the problem rather than our own selves. We talk about addiction as if it is an illness that can be arrested, whilst leaving the rest of the personal ego self intact. We hear what we want to hear and discard the real wisdom. We can fall victim to the mistake of cherry-picking those parts of the fellowship and the steps that seem acceptable to the personal ego self. We may attend meetings, read the literature and even undertake service, yet still avoid recovery. We create our own tailored version of recovery based on what we think is best and ignore the rest of it. We are allowing the personal ego mind to pass judgment on perennial wisdom, and then we try to fool ourselves into believing that our thinking is correct. Self-righteousness prevents us from surrendering to the specific process that has helped so many others. We shoot ourselves in the foot and then blame it on the gun. We may fail to appreciate the seriousness of our condition. We hear that addiction is progressive, but we don't believe that it can possibly happen to us. Serious consequences that have not yet happened to us are considered to be highly unlikely. We ignore the wealth of evidence to the contrary and convince ourselves that our case is different. Our personal minds filter out anything that does not fit with our preconceived ideas. We're blinded by our own self-serving opinions. The personal ego mind always likes to think that it knows best. We're full of opinions and beliefs, but we lack wisdom. Most human beings do not like to feel uncomfortable, and addicts in particular are past masters at avoiding dis-ease. This is why we use substances and addictive behaviours in the first place. Well, change can be uncomfortable, and hence the idea of change is not appealing. But change cannot happen within our comfort zone. We make the mistake of trying to ease our way through recovery by largely avoiding discomfort. We can waste a lot of time pretending to be in recovery without actually making any progress at all. Discomfort is part of the process. This is one reason why fellowship is so important. We provide each other with support and encouragement. It's normal to feel uncomfortable in recovery. and it's also necessary. We may confuse recovery with abstinence. This is an easy and understandable mistake to make, but nevertheless it is a big mistake. Abstinence is obviously necessary and desirable, but it's not the overall objective. We may collect our sobriety coins and receive the applause of our fellows, yet remain firmly stuck in early recovery. And this can sometimes go on for years. The personal ego self is resisting the opportunity for transformation. We fall victim to the acronym JEST, J-E-S-T, which stands for Just Enough Sobriety to achieve our particular personal goals. We trick ourselves into believing that abstinence is the cure to addiction, and that the longer we remain sober, the safer we will be. The truth is that we will remain vulnerable to a relapse until the spiritual solution is in place. Self-sabotage lurks unseen and can surface through all manner of triggering events. After a period of abstinence, we may begin to forget how bad it really was when we first came into recovery. We may experience euphoric recall and dwell upon the seemingly good and happy times, and conveniently overlook all of the misery and harm. The idea may come that perhaps we could resume our previous substances and behaviours, and this time keep it all under control. We may conclude that we are exceptions to the rule of inevitable progression. All the while that we remain identified as the personal ego self, we have the capacity to think ourselves into a disastrous relapse. And we're then puzzled as to why this has happened. We've failed to understand the true nature of the problem and the necessity for the solution. Sometimes this cycle is repeated many times, and it nearly always gets worse. We may be confused about the idea of lifestyle balance. Recovery can be seen as a part-time activity to be integrated with other aspects of life. We may limit our commitment to recovery due to other priorities. We're told that anything that we place ahead of our recovery will eventually be lost through relapse. We hear the advice, but we don't believe it. We insist that we are entitled to set our own priorities. We fail to understand that all of these other priorities are pulling us back into identity as the personal ego self and actually undermining any progress that's being made through 12-step recovery. We're taking one step forward and 2 steps backwards. We obviously need to attend to our particular responsibilities, but recovery needs to be the number one priority until the transformation is well underway. We need an intense period of focus on recovery. There will be plenty of time and opportunity to engage fully in life once the spiritual awakening has begun and the tools are being used. It's a big mistake to try to achieve balance too quickly. This is yet another way in which the personal ego self tries to stay in control of the process. If we manage to overcome all of the obstacles so far, then it will become obvious that we need to get ourselves a sponsor. Addicts generally do not like being told what to do. The idea of having to follow suggestions is not appealing. We may have a clear idea of what sort of sponsor we prefer. We may choose someone who we like and with whom we feel comfortable. The personal ego self is thus dictating the terms of its own recovery. We may delay getting a sponsor indefinitely because we've not yet met anyone who fits our preconceived requirements. We may make a start and then part company because we don't like what's being suggested. We want recovery on our own terms. We lack humility. We are reluctant to commit. We fail to understand that the personal ego self that is making these decisions is the source of the problem. We can misunderstand the meaning of the word suggestions. The 12-step program works and is a suggested means of recovery. If we want recovery, then we need to follow the whole process and use all of the tools. The individual components of the program are not suggestions. It's a mistake to assume that certain elements of the process are not necessary. If we view them as suggestions, then we're likely to avoid the ones that seem unpalatable. We thereby avoid recovery. The 12-step recovery is obviously optional, but if we want recovery, then the whole program is compulsory. It's a potentially fatal mistake to be fooled by the idea of suggestions. Working with a sponsor can be a struggle if we insist on remaining closed-minded. We all have preconceived ideas and beliefs, but we need to let these go. If we have a misplaced faith in our own personal intelligence, then we can create big problems for ourselves. We can end up with paralysis through analysis. We can get stuck at any stage by insisting that we have to fully understand and believe in the process before progressing. Understanding comes through wisdom, and wisdom has nothing to do with personal intelligence. Wisdom is revealed by universal consciousness later on as the transformation proceeds. If we want recovery, then we have to trust the process. Those already in recovery are telling the truth. There's no reason not to trust them. Yet, the personal ego mind trusts only itself. Hence, there's no recovery without humility. We may remain convinced that addiction is a specific problem rather than a feature of the holistic human condition. If addiction is perceived to be a faulty part of an otherwise perfect ego self, then we're in for a long struggle. We may blame all of our shortcomings on addiction, rather than seeing addiction as a manifestation of our human nature. Addiction is not an isolated aspect of the personal ego self. Addiction is a malfunctioning of the entire psyche, based on over-identification as only a personal ego self. 12-step recovery is a holistic solution to a holistic problem. If we focus only on sobriety, then we will continue to suffer the consequences from living life based only on being a person. This is so often clearly obvious from our continuing struggles, yet somehow we manage to miss the fundamental point of recovery. Steps 4 and 5 can be a big stumbling block in recovery. It's not unusual to get stuck at this stage, and sometimes it can result in relapse. We fear looking at our shadow selves, and we fear exposing ourselves to someone else. This self-centered fear is an aspect of the personal ego self, and it keeps us trapped on the surface. Despite praying to be relieved of the bondage of self in step 3, we don't really understand what this means. We know that we need to move forwards, but we come up with all manner of excuses to delay. The personal ego self is protecting itself, and self-centered fear is the primary shield. We come into recovery initially because the fear of relapse outweighs the fear of engaging in 12-step fellowship. If we wait too long and experience a period of sobriety, then the fear of relapse recedes, and the fear of looking at ourselves regains the upper hand. Well, what happens next is inevitable. Either we will relapse, or we will suffer the consequences of holding on to personal ego self in sobriety. If this is understood, then we will push through the fear of steps 4 and 5. We may find the process of recovery emotionally challenging and uncomfortable. We spent our lives suppressing and avoiding intense emotions, and we have medicated these feelings with substances and behaviours. We're now having to go through a potential roller coaster of emotions without our usual coping mechanisms. We assume that we're struggling more than others. We may feel that the process is not working. If we're not cocooned sufficiently in fellowship, then these feelings may lead us to a relapse. If it all gets too uncomfortable, then we may even decide that sobriety is not worth the effort, and hence deliberately relapse in order to stop the process. Until the personal ego self loses its grip, we remain vulnerable to a moment of insane self-sabotage. And we need to be honest about these doubts and fears, and share our thoughts and feelings with our sponsor and fellows. We may be unique individuals, but there are many who have travelled this path before us and have experienced similar issues. We fear judgment, but there will be none. The personal ego self will be tempted to hide these feelings and pretend that all is well. It's far better to be honest. This is one of the reasons why honesty is so important in recovery. Once we have finally worked through the 12 steps and gained a period of sobriety, then we are faced with a new set of obstacles that need to be navigated. The first of these is the belief that we are now cured and can resume our lives without any further involvement in 12-step recovery. The crisis is over and fellowship is no longer required. Well, not only is this selfish, ungrateful and inconsiderate, but it completely misses the whole point of recovery. We've been taken to the edge of our existence, been freely offered the life-changing opportunity of transformation, and have turned our back on the invitation. We've returned to living selfishly and have acted against the will of life itself. There can only be one outcome. Sooner or later, universal consciousness will issue another invitation, and this time it will be more forceful. We all have free will, but free will of this kind will come at a very heavy price. If we do engage effectively in recovery, then life will very likely become busy again. Relationships will be repaired and renewed. Careers may take off. New opportunities will arise, and we will be keen to make up for lost time. All of this activity will place pressure on our priorities. The longer we're in recovery, the more these pressures are likely to build. It will be tempting to push recovery down the priority list. Gradually, we drift away from 12-step fellowship, and gradually we phase out our daily practices. Slowly but surely, the personal ego self regains control. Our state of being returns to cushion 1, and we are back in the madness. If we don't keep spinning the plate of recovery, then eventually it will wobble and crash to the ground. The length of sobriety previously enjoyed will be irrelevant. We'll be back in the hell of addiction. The next trap is similar but relates specifically to overconfidence and complacency. We know that we're not cured, but there's a feeling that we no longer need to put in so much effort. We give ourselves permission to ease off, safe in the knowledge we can always ramp it back up again if things get tricky. There's an assumption that we can control the wild horse of addiction and live dangerously. We still think that life is all about the personal ego self. This attitude always leads to suffering, with or without a relapse. We're making the same mistake as previously, but this time the motives are more subtle. The further we go in recovery, the more subtle the machinations of the personal ego self become. We may become bored with 12-step fellowship. Going to the same meetings every week and hearing the same old shares can become tiresome. We've heard it all before and are no longer learning anything new. We can become irritable and judgmental. All we hear are people moaning about their personal lives. Either that or evangelical sharing, which tends to create rejection rather than attraction. We can come away from meetings feeling worse than before we went in. Our initial enthusiasm is long forgotten, and it all becomes a bit stale. Now we are vulnerable to the familiar thought that we do not really need to bother with recovery anymore. All of this is in the realm of the personal ego mind. We're supposed to be participating in fellowship in order to help others. We're supposed to be selfless rather than selfish and self-centered. If we are bored, then we are being selfish and inconsiderate. 12-step fellowships are comprised of all sorts of people and personalities at different stages of recovery. There may be many that we like, but some that we do not. We may get involved in service at group or intergroup level and get tangled up in the politics of ego. There may be people who disrupt meetings or others that share in ways that we consider inappropriate. The general tone may be one of unconditional love, but we can still find ourselves getting irritated or resentful. We might even clash with others and find ourselves reluctant to attend a particular meeting for fear of conflict. The 12-step fellowship can be a battleground for personal egos, just as much as life outside. All of this reflects and highlights our attachment to the personal ego self. We learned in step 4 to take our own inventory rather than focusing on the behaviour of others. All interactions are an opportunity for self-awareness and the further practice of step 10. It would be a mistake to allow challenging personal relationships to push us away from fellowship. Our purpose is to let go of taking things so personally and to focus instead on being of service to others. Any fellowship of men and women is bound to produce romantic relationships. Mutual vulnerability can be powerfully attractive. The issue here is not one of taboo, but of practicalities. Personal relationships are, by definition, personal. Our purpose in recovery is to move away from the personal ego self. Intimate relationships can be a trigger for the whole range of negative human attributes and hence restrict recovery. If we're single, then it's suggested that we remain so until we are fully established in recovery. If we're married or already in a relationship, then again the suggestion is to maintain the status quo until we are in a position to be guided by universal consciousness rather than the ego mind. These suggestions make sense in the context of the overall objective of recovery. We are, of course, at liberty to ignore these suggestions, but it would be wise at least to understand our motives. Romantic relationships can be another subtle trap that frustrates recovery. In some cases, they can lead to relapse. The daily spiritual toolkit is comprehensive and necessary. We are bound to individually favour some practices over others. It will be tempting to practice those tools that we enjoy and avoid those that we do not. This is the personal ego self trying to muscle in on spiritual practice. This is a very subtle form of self-sabotage that perpetuates the personal self-identity. We will tend to dislike the tools that feel personally uncomfortable. We need the courage and wisdom from the Serenity prayer to see this trap. It's the tools that we personally dislike that offer us the most potential for change. The very fact that we don't like them is the best possible reason for practicing them. We are acting against the preferences of the personal ego self and thereby working to shift the balance of identity. We can fool ourselves that we're doing well in recovery by practicing with only part of the toolkit. It's far more worthwhile to practice the tools that we resist. Wisdom arises from universal consciousness, and it would be wise to discard personal preferences. If we come into recovery having already been strongly indoctrinated into a particular faith, then we may find difficulty in reconciling these pre-existing beliefs with the principles of 12-step recovery. All faiths and spiritual traditions are actually underpinned by the same perennial wisdom, but this is not always obvious to those who believe that their faith is exclusively correct. There can also be an immature understanding of what any particular faith truly means. We may have faith, but this is of little use if the identity of the personal ego self remains unchallenged. If parts of the spiritual toolkit do not fit into our current faith-based understanding or practice, it may seem to make sense to ignore them. We need to remain open-minded. There is tremendous wisdom in the 12-step fellowship. The great thing about the 12-step program is that it's a process intended to bring about individual transformation and revelation. Whatever our conditioned faith may have been, it has previously been insufficient to overcome addiction. 12-step fellowship will allow access to wisdom that reveals and heals the core problem. It can also provide a deeper understanding of any pre-existing faith. We may find it relatively easy to follow spiritual principles within 12-step fellowship, but might still be tempted to think and behave selfishly or dishonestly in other areas of our lives. This is another example of where we can make progress in recovery on the one hand, and then undo all of the good work by continuing with behaviours that pull us in the opposite direction. Selfishness and dishonesty are aspects of the personal ego self. It will often be tempting to act selfishly, but this is more destructive than we may realise. If we want good recovery, then we need to be practicing these principles in all of our affairs. There are no exceptions. Even small acts of selfishness are counterproductive. We need to remain self-aware and watch out for the many subtle ways in which the personal ego self continues to hold on. It's difficult enough for us to understand 12-step recovery, let alone our family and friends. It may be that they do not support our involvement. They may even feel that our loyalties have been diverted elsewhere and that we now give them insufficient attention. They may complain or make it difficult for us to give priority to recovery. They can be so familiar with our old personal selves that they don't like how we are changing as we recover. We may find family and friends pulling us away from 12-step recovery at the very time that we need it. We can't expect them to understand, but we do need their encouragement and support. If this is not forthcoming, then we will need the support of the fellowship even more. It's sometimes difficult to trust strangers above our own family and friends, but in truth, we have little choice. Our loved ones will reap the benefits once we become established in recovery. We can become proud of our period of sobriety, proud of our recovery, proud of our own story, proud of the service that we do, proud of our ability to help others, proud of our track record as a sponsor, proud of our achievements outside of fellowship, proud of our spiritual qualities and wisdom, and basically proud of anything that the personal ego self can find to take pride in. We may even be proud of being humble. This pride is so very subtle, yet pride is one of the biggest hurdles to overcome. We're seeking freedom from the bondage of personal ego self, and pride is obviously personal. Universal consciousness has nothing to be proud of. It just is itself and is non-personal. Honest self-awareness is again the answer to this trap. Pride will sneak in from all directions, but we have the power to see it and discard it. The final trap in this list may perhaps seem to be a bit of a surprise. When we attend 12-step meetings, it's traditional to identify ourselves as addicts. Typically we state our name and our addictions. This identification as an addict is repetitive and powerful. We are restating our personal identity time and time again at each meeting that we attend. The purpose of recovery is to let go of the personal ego self, yet we habitually remain attached to it. The personal ego self is the addict. Our true identity as universal consciousness is not an addict. The personal ego self is powerless. Consciousness is powerful. We need to submit to a process that brings about a transformation in this identity. Anything that we do to undermine this process is not helpful. It's not for me to suggest a change in tradition, but we do need to be mindful of how we identify ourselves. It's true to say that my name is Michael and that Michael is an alcoholic. It's not true to say that I am Michael and that I am an alcoholic. I'm not Michael. I am universal consciousness manifesting as an individual with the name of Michael. Personal identity is just a thought, and it's our belief in this thought that convinces us that we are only a personal ego self. This common belief in personhood is a misunderstanding, and it's the ultimate block to the transformational freedom that we all seek. This list of 30 potential pitfalls in recovery is fairly comprehensive, but highly unlikely to be complete. The personal ego mind ranges from gross to subtle, and hence there must be many more ways in which we can trip up. I have made nearly all of these mistakes during my years in 12-step fellowship, and I dare say that I will make many more yet. All 30 of these pitfalls, and many more besides, have one factor in common. They are all ways in which we hold on to identity as the personal ego self. We decide in step 3 to hand over our will and our lives to universal consciousness, but somehow we never actually go through with it. This is why recovery is progressive rather than definitive. We need to keep using the daily tools in order to continue to make progress. Given that effective recovery hinges on the extent to which we remain over-identified as a personal ego self, it can be seen that perhaps the most incisive and helpful tool in the box is the tool of self-inquiry. Whichever hurdle we may be facing at any given time, we can always ask ourselves who it is that thinks there's a problem. The answer is always the same. It's the personal ego self. This simple tool disempowers the personal identity every single time that it's used. By asking the question and observing the personal ego mind, we automatically drop back in consciousness to the position of witness. We drop back from cushion 1 to cushion 2. If self-inquiry is practiced on a daily basis, then we can become increasingly aware that there's more to life than we had previously understood. We cannot be the personal ego self because we are always present as awareness to witness it. It follows, therefore, that our true nature must be that of a deeper consciousness. We may struggle to believe it, but the truth is present every time that we take the trouble to look. The best way to mind the gaps is to remain self-aware and to practice self-inquiry. This simple tool will immediately highlight the problem, and we can then get on with using the rest of the toolkit to continue the journey home. The result will be happiness, peace, love, and unity. The promises will come true.